I want you to have a think about the most awkward conversation you've ever had. What was it about that conversation that made you so uncomfortable in that moment? Was it something that you've been thinking about for a while? Or maybe it was something that you've wanted to bring up, but you weren't too sure how to navigate the conversation, so you haven't really said anything just yet, but you finally muster up the courage to say something. Your palms are sweating, your heart's racing, your tummy's turning into knots, and you finally blurt out those words. Hey, can I just have a quick chat with you? As soon as you say it, instant regret. You want to take them back, but you've got their attention now, you've got to go through with it, and you can't go back. So you have the awkward conversation. As soon as it's over, you kind of sit back and think to yourself, that wasn't so bad. I don't know what I was so worried about. No matter how much we try to mentally prepare ourselves for these awkward and uncomfortable conversations, going through those never-ending scenarios in our head, replaying every possible outcome that we can think of, it never gets any easier. We always have that desire to simply forget about things, push them to the back of mind, and just push all our fears and anxieties away, only for them to creep back up days, weeks, or even months later. At the end of the day, we're only human. We're never going to have 100% certainty as to how the other person's going to respond to us. We're always going to have that little bit of doubt, that little bit of the unknown. What happens if I upset them? What happens if they're angry with me? What happens if they don't like what I have to say? At the end of the day, a lot of us experience very similar situations. We all have the same fears, the same anxieties, and the same doubts, and the exact same desire to avoid these conversations completely. So if we all feel the same way, why can't we talk about it? When I reflect on my teenage years growing up in an entirely female, Italian, and Catholic household, I definitely think it's safe to say that I have had my fair share of awkward and uncomfortable conversations. The idea of talking about topics relating to sex, let alone dating or relationships, were things that were completely off limits in my household. And the reality is that a lot of young people experience very similar situations. They don't know how to navigate these topics and have the awkward conversation. From as little as we can remember, we've learnt that the person of our dreams is going to sweep us off our feet in this whirlwind romance. Or perhaps we've thought of it as the person who we're not too keen on at first, and they repeatedly ask us out on dates. We say no, they ask us out again, we say no again, they do it again, and we finally give in, only to fall madly in love and have the absolute time of our lives. When you think about it, as a society, we've been conditioned to believe that if you want something, it doesn't really matter how you go about getting it. You've just got to go out there and take it. And if mainstream media, television shows, and film have taught us anything, it's that the best, most romantic gestures are the ones that completely catch you off guard and sweep you off your feet. From as little as 3 years old, we've been taught that the prince or princess of our dreams is the knight in shining armor that takes charge of a situation and doesn't take no for an answer. It's taught us that the idea of true romance is that surprise kiss that wakes us up from the eternal slumber. But if that's what we've been taught is the idea of true romance, how can we be expected to navigate conversations around consent when we rarely see it at all? When we look further into mainstream forms of traditional sex education, we can see a very similar narrative. Topics like dating, sex, and relationships are often seen as private matters that shouldn't really be discussed. We are both subconsciously and overtly taught to avoid these taboo topics, and as a result, we make what should be very preventable mistakes. When we choose to avoid these conversations in the classroom and in our personal lives, we're not protecting ourselves, nor are we protecting those around us. Studies show that abstinence-only education does not actually delay teen sex, nor does it prevent their likelihood of engaging in sexually risky behaviours. So if we can't see positive conversations around consent in the classroom, and we can't see or hear about them in the media, where can we learn? The idea of asking for consent is so often thought of as this mood killer, this notion that if I ask for permission for something to happen, it's weird and uncomfortable. So a lot of people simply avoid it. But we have to think that if we look at consent language as something that is awkward or uncomfortable, what else might we see as awkward? When we as a society choose to actively not engage in conversations around consent, are we not just encouraging a culture of complacency? Are we not just inviting a culture of silence? Are we not just creating an environment where people feel as though they can't speak out when they actually are uncomfortable and things don't feel quite right to them? The harsh reality is that 1 in 4 Australian women and 1 in 12 Australian men over the age of 18 have experienced some form of sexual violence in their lifetime. When we choose not to engage in initial conversations around consent, how can we expect people to be able to speak out when things do not feel right? How are we expected to know where that silence begins and where that silence ends? 83.1% of Australian women did not report their most recent incident of sexual offence. Now, whilst these statistics might seem quite confronting, they're not at all uncommon. We are constantly faced with data and information surrounding the prevalence of sexual violence, sexual assault, and sexual harassment. And whilst efforts are being made to change things at a systemic level, it's time we start looking within. It's time we start trying to create change at an individual level. So what can we do? Where to from here? How can we positively contribute to an environment where individuals feel comfortable to navigate conversations around consent? There have been far too many times to count where young people have come together only to realize that their education has failed them. We're rarely taught what a healthy or unhealthy relationship looks like. We're rarely taught about what consent actually is, and more importantly, how to use consent language. Young people are very rarely given the practical tools and tips they need in order to navigate these topics in their actual lives. Teachings like this are not uncommon. Hundreds of thousands of young people across Australia are still being taught the same things today. So it's time we make that change. By changing the dialogue surrounding consent and sex education, we'll ultimately better equip Australians to navigate topics around dating, sex, and relationships, and more importantly, encourage an environment where individuals feel comfortable enough to speak out around incidences of sexual assault and sexual harassment. Studies actually show that when we provide high-quality, comprehensive, and rights-based sex education, that we can actually reduce the individual's likelihood of engaging in sexually risky behaviours, such as unprotected intercourse, and also help to reduce the impact of negative sexual experiences, as well as sexualised violence. It's time we start to ask ourselves what it is about consent that makes us so uncomfortable. It's so important to remind ourselves that it's actually okay to feel a little bit awkward at times. We have to begin to challenge what mainstream media tells us is the idea of true romance, that it should only be one-sided and only be spontaneous. It's time we start to question what our favourite TV shows and favourite films have taught us. It's time we begin to create a new dream, and not just a dream for ourselves, but a dream for future generations to come. A dream where individuals feel comfortable enough to engage in conversations around consent. A dream where they feel comfortable enough to assert their boundaries. When they say the word no, that no is respected. A dream where the idea of true romance is born out of mutual respect and open communication. As corny as it sounds, a really big part of the solution is actually quite simple. It starts with us all asking questions. It starts with a conversation.